Well, I'm Allison, and Rodney had asked me to participate, and I'm one of the 2 future co-editors of Cultural Anthropology, and Kim and Mike are the current co-editors. So I can't really comment on what the journal has done, so I don't quite know how you would like me to comment. I mean, I'm at Duke. I've written a lot about sexuality and gender. My most recent work hasn't been about that, but I've been teaching classes. So I've just finished teaching a class on sex and money, which always gets high enrollments for some reason. The first time I taught it at Duke, which was about 4 years ago, I probably, like most universities, they allow seniors to, sign up for classes first and then juniors. And I had at least 4 students write and say, Professor Allison, I really want to make sure I get into this class because it's important for my future. Is it the sex part or the money part? I don't even want to know, I don't think. Sex for my... So what we've done in the class, maybe I could just, I just finished talking about it, but what I do in the class is I talk about both sex and money as currencies. So money obviously being some sort of currency for exchange and payment, or selling or buying something. But then sex, when you think about it as a currency, becomes a little bit harder to figure out what precisely that's a currency of and for. And I always ask the students to give me a quick definition of money, which they can do really easily. Then when I ask for a quick definition of sex, I don't know if it's because they don't quite know how to say this in public, or they'll say, oh, it's something that 2 people use to express their love. Oh, really? Okay. Anyone else? So that's always kind of interesting to hear then what people are thinking about with sex. But the way that we ended, and again, this is just because I think we'll just be throwing things out here. We did a number. I went through the Marxian notion. We went through exchange. We did a lot of commodity. Did a lot with Freud, Foucault, and then a lot of sex work and reproductive work. The last part of it was selling semen and eggs, and then went to different body parts. And I had kind of run out of ideas. So the last week I said, well, let's just think about us, or mainly you, Duke students, and try to think about your lives at Duke, and maybe about hookup culture. And that jazzed them and excited them almost more than anything in the whole class. I broke them up into little groups and had them start thinking about, again, I said, so think about what is the currency of money at a place like Duke? What is the currency of sex? What is it a currency of? And how do the 2 come together? And actually, not that we necessarily could do anything on, hookup culture in the journal, but it was so interesting to hear how that really tapped into, I think, the students' imaginations. It touches on gender. What is hookup for a girl, as they call themselves at Duke? What is a hookup for a guy? Ethnically, it's different. A lot of people said, well, hookup culture at Duke is very white. The African American community has hookups that are different. It kind of plays into a lot of different issues about future. People said that it doesn't really matter, money doesn't really matter at Duke until you leave it. So that, because everyone has money, everyone has smarts. In any case, so that, there are a lot of different ways I think that we can think about gender and sexuality. And what would be really interesting is people from all see what are the kinds of issues that you think the journal should be dealing with that might plug into gender and sexuality. It strikes me that there are a lot of different ways that we can think about that.
I just have a question. Is there, from what you know, is there a literature on this in any time and place that is the kind of starting point for?
The literature on hookup. Well, it's interesting because, as I'm sure you all know, at Duke we had a lacrosse incident that was pretty horrific now a while ago. And in the wake of that, the university assembled a committee, of which I was a member, to investigate campus culture. And I was on the Sexuality and Gender team. And we discovered that hookups were really pervasive at Duke, and we started doing our own kind of study, and we did a lot of focus groups, and then I wound up co-teaching a class on hookup culture. And there's very little written about it, but it's so interesting that it plugs into all these different things, I think, that are really relevant, because what our students would say, well, what our students said at the time is, if you want to have a relationship that lasts in time, you actually don't have a hookup. So it's not like a hookup. I mean, obviously it's so much older than these students. I mean, it used to be, yeah, even with promiscuous sex, that often that becomes a possible starting point for a relationship. The students actually said, at least this is what they told us 4 years ago, if you want a relationship, actually you don't have a hookup, because a hookup is antithetical to a relationship. And then we would ask, so then what is the idea of a hookup? Is it about pleasure, you might imagine? And they'd say, well, actually, the condition of a hookup is being totally drunk. So you have to be kind of blitzo. So if you're kind of blitzo, you often don't even remember whether it was pleasurable or not. So we said, so was it good sex? So usually you don't even know. You don't really remember. So that's not even part of the calculus. And so the person I was co-teaching the class with, we both were just, we're strong feminists. It's not that we necessarily, pro-sex. It's not necessarily that we're imagining promiscuous sex is bad. It's just like, well, shouldn't at least be good sex if you're going to do it. So, like, what are we missing? And it was so hard for us to kind of get what it was, because the alcohol, and then why the alcohol? And when I was just talking to my class last week, well, someone said, well, alcohol's another currency. I mean, there's money, and then there's a currency of alcohol. And that's another currency that's not exactly about money, and it's not exactly about sex, but it falls into there. And so, as far as I know, no, there's not a literature. So actually, that might be a really interesting thing to do in the journal, because we haven't read, there's journalistic accounts. I haven't read anything interesting, scholarly, or profound about it, and yet it seems kind of mystifying, and it seems to cut into sexuality and gender in a slightly new way, which might be another way of thinking about what we could do with the journal. I mean, how can we get at sexuality and gender in slightly different ways that in fact isn't being addressed? And just from the responses of the students like so wanted to talk about, because this also kind of intrigues them, like, what is this? And anyway, it's just been kind of an interesting thing.
In the case of it intriguing students, is there any sign or any inclination that some students are actually going to focus on this and actually produce work and sort of study that could be we could attract them to the possibility of having a conversation that encourages that, so that there is this sort of a space for discussion that leads to work that...
That would be interesting to imagine how we would do that, because I would imagine that hookup, what I understand is that hookup culture is fairly pervasive in the U.S. university scene, and also when I first was part of this committee that came out of the lacrosse incident, I went to Japan to teach for a semester, and we wanted to have we wanted to have a web conversation between the two campuses about hookups, and we weren't able to do it. But in Japan, hookups were happening too. So I think it's not just, based in the U.S. I think it's all over the world. But I think there are these differences, because in Japan, then apparently you can hook up fairly promiscuously, but then apparently there's much more interest in telling someone that you love them, or that even if it's only for one night. So you love someone, but then maybe the next hookup, you're already loving the next person. But according to our Duke students, you don't tell them you love them. Sometimes you don't even know what their name is. And almost instantaneously when the sex is done, you display disinterest. I mean, that's the coding. And if you don't get it, if like the next day you say, gee, that was great, it's like you've already transgressed the code. The code is that you don't even act like there's any relationship, which for an anthropologist, I'm interested in sociality. What's the sociality there? It's almost like there's no sociality. But
the role of the text message might have.
Yeah, that's one of the things I unfortunately have to leave for another meeting, so if I could just jump in. There are two things I was thinking about. I think the way that this is mediated through text messaging, but also Facebook, and a lot of